In late February 2025, at the Laizhou port area of Yantai port in eastern China, a towering crane lowered a container packed with Canadian peas onto the docks. The shipment, routine on the surface, carried a deeper geopolitical undertone. China, once the largest buyer of American farm goods, continues to diversify away from U.S. agricultural imports as the U.S. China tariff standoff deepens. Welcome viewers to my channel. Please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. For Washington, the clock is running down on trade negotiations that could help avert what former Treasury official Scott Bessent, who served under President Donald Trump, has warned is shaping into an unsustainable tariff war. Yet while policymakers wrangle over strategies and countermeasures, much of the damage to American farmers has already been inflicted. Across the United States, agriculture exporters report that retaliatory measures by China and other countries have triggered a chain reaction of canceled contracts, slumping prices, mounting losses, and widespread layoffs. The ripple effects are extending far beyond farmers' fields and into rural communities, transportation hubs, and ports that rely heavily on international trade. Peter Friedman, executive director of the Agriculture Transportation Coalition (AGTC), one of the country's leading farm export trade associations, says the sector is not merely facing a looming threat. It is a full-blown crisis already, he told CNBC. His assessment echoes the mood of exporters who describe financial hemorrhaging as immediate and escalating. Fresh data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture underscored the severity. China recently made its largest cancellation of American pork orders since 2020, scrapping a shipment of 12,000 tons. The move sent shockwaves through the already fragile hog industry, where producers depend on large-scale overseas demand to keep operations viable. AGTC reports have poured in from members detailing how the trade war is disrupting every link of the supply chain. A wood pulp and paperboard exporter disclosed the sudden cancellation or suspension of 6,400 metric tons of product, with another 15 railcars stranded and accruing costly demurrage fees as they sit idle. Meanwhile, 9,000 metric tons are already en route to China, set to arrive in May, but facing the real possibility of abandonment in port or expensive diversion to other destinations. A grass seed exporter relayed a similar story. Chinese customers abruptly canceled 8 booked loads with just 2 weeks' notice, despite vessels already scheduled and shipping slots secured. The crisis is not confined to farms and exporters. At the Port of Oakland, a critical gateway for California's agricultural exports, officials are warning that retaliatory tariffs threaten the very stability of the regional economy. Executive Director Christy McKenney said a decline in cargo volumes, whether from fewer imports or slumping exports, could undercut job security for thousands of workers who depend on steady port activity. Unlike many U.S. ports, Oakland maintains a nearly even balance of imports and exports. That balance, once a source of resilience, now leaves the port acutely vulnerable. China remains Oakland's largest import partner and its third largest export partner, representing nearly 30% of the port's total trade volume. Retaliatory tariffs on high-value farm goods such as almonds, dairy, pork, beef, and hay, much of which heads to Asia, could slice into California's share of global markets and depress farmgate incomes. Representative Latifah Simon, Democrat of California, expressed deep concern. So many local, union jobs depend on the port's robust shipping operations, dock workers, truck operators, warehouse workers. I support smart trade policies that uplift workers and lower costs for Oakland's working families, not an illogical and retaliatory trade war. The stakes are especially high because Oakland is the #1 refrigerated export hub in the U.S. Nearly all containerized cargo from Northern California, including fragile perishable goods, moves through its terminals. Any sustained decline in export traffic risks creating bottlenecks, food waste, and permanent loss of overseas customers. Agricultural exporters caution that alternative markets cannot replace China's enormous demand, at least not in the near term. For many, the sudden loss of access to Chinese buyers is already pushing prices downward. One lumber exporter reported to AGTC that it has had to slash production, reassign staff to less profitable product lines, and cut back dramatically on orders from independent vendors such as truckers, loggers, and sawmills. Lumber products destined for China are now flooding the U.S. domestic market, driving values down by as much as 20%. This, the exporter warned, is already reshaping inventory planning and chilling long-term investment decisions. For forage exporters, a vital but often overlooked segment supplying hay and straw to overseas livestock farms, the situation is dire. One major company disclosed that since Trump announced new tariffs in early April, it has endured 68 blanked sailings, meaning scheduled vessels skipped U.S. ports altogether. With ship space constrained, these exporters are unable to get goods to buyers even when orders exist, raising fears of spoiled inventory and lost market share. The growing crisis in U.S. agriculture underscores a painful truth. Once trust is broken in global supply chains, rebuilding relationships takes years. Chinese buyers, wary of unpredictability in American policy, are already strengthening partnerships with Canada, Brazil, and Australia to secure steady supplies of pork, soybeans, lumber, and grain. For American farmers, this means that even if trade disputes are eventually resolved, winning back lost customers may not be automatic. When you lose market share, you don't get it back easily, Friedman warns. The economic stakes extend beyond farms and ports. Rural communities, already grappling with thin margins, volatile commodity prices, and labor shortages, could face another wave of bankruptcies. Trucking companies, rail operators, and warehouse firms tied to agricultural exports are bracing for layoffs. The longer tariffs persist, the more permanent the restructuring of global agricultural trade becomes. Policymakers in Washington face a narrowing window. Without swift trade agreements, especially with China, exporters warn that damage may soon become irreversible. The diversification of China's supply lines, coupled with declining confidence among U.S. agricultural stakeholders, suggests that the cost of this trade war could outlast the political cycle that triggered it. For now, cranes continue to unload peas from Canadian ships in Yantai, a symbolic reminder that the world is adapting to life beyond U.S. farm exports. For American producers, the crisis is no longer approaching, it is here, reshaping their livelihoods in real time. On the final day of February 2025, at the Laizhou port area of Yantai in eastern China, cranes moved rhythmically, lowering massive containers onto the docks. One shipment, filled with Canadian peas, symbolized much more than routine global commerce. It stood as a vivid reminder that China, once the largest and most dependable buyer of American farm goods, has now shifted decisively toward alternative suppliers. The change is no accident. It is the direct outcome of a simmering U.S. China trade conflict that has once again escalated under President Donald Trump's second administration. Former Treasury official Scott Bessent, who served under Trump, issued a stark warning earlier this year. Without urgent trade agreements, the United States risks plunging into what he described as an unsustainable tariff war. For policymakers in Washington, this message may still feel abstract, debated in policy rooms and campaign rallies. But for America's farmers and exporters, the crisis has already landed with crushing force. Across the country, agriculture exporters are watching decades of hard-earned markets unravel in a matter of months. Retaliatory tariffs, canceled contracts, and collapsing demand from Chinese buyers have triggered financial losses measured in billions of dollars. The ripple effects are not limited to farms but extend to ports, shipping lines, trucking companies, and entire rural economies that rely on global trade to stay afloat. Peter Friedman, executive director of the Agriculture Transportation Coalition, AGTC, one of the leading farm export trade groups in the U.S., put it bluntly in a recent interview, this should not be described as approaching a crisis. It is a full-blown crisis already. Data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture (USDA) showed that China abruptly canceled a shipment of 12,000 tons of pork, its largest cancellation since 2020. The decision sent a shudder through the pork industry, where farmers depend on steady Chinese demand to offset domestic surpluses. For hog producers, margins were already slim. The cancellation meant immediate losses, but also a long-term erosion of trust in a market they once considered reliable. Reports compiled by AGTC illustrate how the crisis is spreading across multiple sectors. A wood pulp and paperboard exporter reported that 6,400 metric tons of product in storage had been suddenly placed on hold, with an additional 15 railcars stranded in demurrage, a costly situation in which shipping containers rack up fees as they sit idle awaiting clearance. Meanwhile, another 9,000 metric tons were already on the water, bound for China and scheduled to arrive in May, but facing the grim prospect of rejection upon arrival. For grass seed exporters, the situation is equally dire. One company reported that Chinese buyers canceled 8 booked shipments with only 2 weeks' notice, even though vessels had already been scheduled and freight space paid for. The result? Stranded inventory, wasted shipping costs, and a growing sense of helplessness. While farmers feel the brunt of canceled sales, the damage also ripples into the nation's ports. At the Port of Oakland, California's busiest export gateway and a critical artery for the state's farm economy, officials are raising alarms about the broader economic fallout. At a stakeholder meeting earlier this year, Oakland's executive director Christy McKinney warned that tariff-induced downturns in cargo volume threaten job security and the economic stability of the region. A decline in exports or imports doesn't just affect shipping companies, she explained. It puts thousands of jobs at risk, from dock workers and truck drivers to warehouse